The Pacific was quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, a storm was rising. In the early months of 1942, the world's largest ocean had turned into a vast chessboard where the Empire of Japan was making its most daring moves. After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan's war machine was unstoppable, sweeping across the Pacific like a wildfire. One island after another fell to its relentless advance: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and with each victory, Tokyo's ambitions grew bolder. Its eyes were now fixed on Australia, the last major Allied stronghold in the southern Pacific. If Japan could isolate Australia by cutting its sea routes and capturing nearby territories, it could choke the Allies' southern lifeline and possibly force a negotiated peace. To achieve that, the Japanese High Command devised Operation Mo, a plan to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. From those bases, Japan could control the Coral Sea and threaten Australia directly. It was a bold plan, one that assumed the Americans were still too shaken from Pearl Harbor to react quickly. But Japan underestimated two things: the resilience of the U.S. Navy and the power of information. In a small, windowless room in Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts were quietly breaking Japanese naval codes. By late April 1942, they intercepted messages revealing Japan's intentions toward Port Moresby. For Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, this was the break he needed. Instead of waiting for Japan to strike first, he decided to meet them head-on. Nimitz formed a task force under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, built around two aircraft carriers, the USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, and ordered them into the Coral Sea to intercept the enemy. For the men aboard those ships, the mission felt like sailing into the unknown. Many of them had joined the Navy during peacetime, never expecting to face the Japanese fleet in battle. The Coral Sea, a vast stretch of blue water northeast of Australia, would soon become their testing ground and the birthplace of a new kind of naval warfare. In early May, Japanese invasion forces began moving south. Their fleet was divided into several groups, one headed toward Tulagi, another escorting the Port Moresby invasion convoy, and two powerful aircraft carriers, Shokaku and Ziwikaku, providing air cover. The smaller carrier Shoho sailed ahead to give additional protection. As they advanced, the Japanese believed surprise was on their side. What they didn't know was that Fletcher's task force was already waiting. On May 3, Japanese troops landed on Tulagi Island and quickly overran the small Australian garrison stationed there. The next day, Fletcher struck back. Aircraft from the USS Yorktown screamed across the sky, swooping down on Japanese ships anchored off Tulagi. In a flurry of explosions and smoke, several enemy vessels were destroyed, and Japan realized, for the first time, that the Americans were not as crippled as they had hoped. Still, both sides remained largely blind to each other's exact positions. The vastness of the Pacific made every encounter a matter of chance and timing. Reconnaissance planes roamed endlessly, scanning miles of open sea for any hint of movement. On the decks of the carriers, pilots waited tensely beside their planes, listening to radio reports and watching the horizon. Every launch order felt like a gamble with fate. By May 6, the weather began to turn rough, clouds gathering over the sea like gray curtains hiding the enemy. Japanese scouts believed they had found the American carriers, but in reality, they had spotted only a small supply group. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance planes sighted the light carrier Shoho guarding the Japanese invasion convoy. Admiral Fletcher saw his chance. He ordered an all-out air assault. The morning of May 7 broke with the roar of engines as waves of American aircraft took off from Lexington and Yorktown. High above the Coral Sea, the air shimmered with sunlight and tension. The pilots flew low, skimming over the water, until the dark outline of Shoho appeared below them. Within minutes, bombs and torpedoes rained down. "She's hit. She's hit again," the radio crackled. Flames burst from the Japanese carrier as explosions tore through its deck. In less than 10 minutes, Shoho was dead in the water, burning furiously before sliding beneath the waves. The jubilant voice of one U.S. pilot echoed through the headset, "Scratch one flat top." For the Japanese, it was their first carrier loss of the war, a shocking reminder that the Americans could hit back hard. Yet the main battle was still to come. Both sides continued searching for each other's main fleet carriers, each determined to land the decisive blow. The ocean became a battlefield of shadows and rumors. Every radar blip, every scout report could mean victory or disaster. Life aboard the carriers was tense. Below decks, sailors worked in stifling heat to keep the engines running, while above, crews rearmed planes for the next strike. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and nervous anticipation. At night, the sea glowed faintly under starlight, silent except for the hum of the ships cutting through the waves. No one slept easily. Japanese commanders, unaware of how much the Americans knew, pressed on with their Port Moresby plan. They were confident that their two big carriers, Shokaku and Ziwikaku, could handle whatever resistance appeared. But the Americans had learned to use their limited forces smartly. Fletcher's decision to divide his carriers allowed him to cover more ocean and confuse Japanese scouts. Both fleets were within striking distance, yet neither knew the other's exact location. As May 8 approached, the Coral Sea was poised on the edge of chaos. In just a few hours, hundreds of aircraft would take off in opposite directions, guided only by coordinates and hope, to fight an enemy they could not see. The men aboard Lexington and Yorktown didn't know that the coming day would change naval history forever. For the first time, two powerful fleets would clash without a single ship firing directly at another. It would be a battle fought entirely by airplanes, a battle that would redefine how wars were fought on the oceans. Far away in Tokyo, Japanese commanders expected another swift victory. In Washington, President Roosevelt and Admiral Nimitz waited for reports, uncertain whether their outnumbered forces could hold the line. And somewhere in between, on that vast blue expanse of water, hundreds of young men were preparing to write their own chapter of history. The Coral Sea lay calm under the morning sun, but everyone could feel it. The storm was about to break. The hunt begins. The morning sun of May 4, 1942, rose over the Coral Sea, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Beneath that calm beauty, hundreds of men on both sides were already preparing for battle. The ocean was vast, but somewhere out there, the enemy waited. Neither the Americans nor the Japanese could see each other, yet both fleets were on a collision course that would soon change the face of naval warfare forever. For Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the USS Yorktown, the situation was as tense as it was uncertain. His orders were clear: intercept the Japanese invasion force before it reached Port Moresby. But the Coral Sea was enormous, a floating labyrinth stretching over 1,000,000 square miles. Finding the enemy here was like hunting shadows in an endless mirror of water. Every report from reconnaissance planes mattered. Every radar contact could be real or an illusion. Fletcher knew one wrong move could doom his entire fleet. As the day began, the Americans had one small advantage: information. The code breakers at Pearl Harbor had already given them a rough idea of Japan's plan. Fletcher used that intelligence like a compass in the dark, sending scout planes in wide arcs to search the sea. Hundreds of miles away, the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, was doing the same. His fleet, which included the powerful carriers Shokaku and Ziwikaku, moved cautiously southward, believing the Americans were still far away. At 7 a.m., a Japanese reconnaissance plane from the light carrier Shoho spotted a few American oilers and escort ships. Mistakenly thinking these were the main U.S. carriers, Takagi ordered an airstrike. Bombers screamed through the clouds, only to find themselves dropping ordnance on empty supply ships. The attack accomplished nothing but gave away Japan's presence. Meanwhile, American scouts discovered the real prize, the Shoho itself, guarding the invasion convoy north of New Guinea. Admiral Fletcher wasted no time. By noon, the decks of Lexington and Yorktown thundered with the sound of launching aircraft. Dozens of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes lifted off in formation, streaking south toward the unsuspecting Shaho. The ocean below shimmered with light as the planes descended upon their target. From the Japanese ship, lookouts shouted warnings as tiny black dots appeared against the sun. Within seconds, bombs began to fall. Explosions ripped through Shaho's deck, flames shot skyward as torpedoes smashed into her hull. Sailors scrambled to abandon ship, but it was too late. Direct hit amidships, one American pilot radioed. Another's voice crackled triumphantly, "She's burning. She's done for." In less than 10 minutes, Shaho disappeared beneath the waves. As the pilots circled above the smoking debris, one voice transmitted a message that would echo through history: "Scratch one flat top." The victory electrified the U.S. fleet. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American sailors had sunk a Japanese carrier. Yet Fletcher knew this was only the beginning. The larger Japanese carriers Shokaku and Ziwikaku were still out there, and they would not remain hidden for long. That night, the ocean seemed deceptively peaceful. The stars reflected off the water like shards of glass, and the carriers drifted quietly in the dark. On the flight decks, mechanics worked by red lamplight, refueling planes and reloading bombs. The smell of gasoline and salt hung thick in the air. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese were doing the same, preparing for the next day's confrontation. On May 6, the hunt grew more desperate. Both sides knew they were closing in on each other, but poor weather and scattered clouds made detection nearly impossible. Aircraft from both navies fanned out in every direction, flying low over the sea to spot the enemy. Pilots faced exhaustion, their eyes scanning endless blue with no sign of ships. Many planes returned with fuel tanks nearly empty, their pilots drenched in sweat and frustration. Late that afternoon, a Japanese scout misidentified a group of small U.S. destroyers as carriers. Takagi, believing he had found the main American force, launched a massive strike. Dozens of bombers took off, but the coordinates were wrong. The attack force found nothing but open ocean. It was a costly mistake, wasting fuel and time. Meanwhile, the Americans stayed silent, their radio operators listening carefully for Japanese transmissions. Fletcher was patient, he wanted to strike when he was sure. Life aboard the carriers had become a cycle of tension and silence. The men barely spoke at meals, listening instead for the alarm that could sound at any moment. Pilots slept in their flight suits. Anti-aircraft gunners practiced loading drills in the dark. There was no music, no laughter, just the constant hum of engines and the distant crash of waves. Everyone knew the real battle hadn't even started yet. That evening, Admiral Fletcher met with his officers in the narrow operations room aboard the Yorktown. The walls were lined with maps dotted by pins and pencil marks showing estimated enemy positions. Reports from reconnaissance pilots suggested that the main Japanese carriers were only a few hundred miles away, hidden behind a curtain of tropical storms. Fletcher's face was calm, but his mind was racing. He had to decide whether to move north and risk a night encounter or hold his position and strike at dawn. After a long pause, he made his choice: wait until morning. It was a gamble that would define the battle's outcome. Elsewhere, on the Japanese carrier Shokaku, pilots were also preparing for dawn. They believed the next day would bring an easy victory. Japan's record so far in the Pacific was unmatched. Every engagement since Pearl Harbor had ended in triumph. The officers aboard Shokaku drank tea and talked quietly, unaware that the Americans were now just over the horizon. In the dark hours before sunrise on May 7, the Coral Sea was cloaked in fog and tension. Both fleets had spent days searching for one another, like predators circling in the mist. Each commander believed he was about to surprise the other. The ocean held its breath. At 6 a.m., engines began to roar once again. Scout planes lifted off from both sides almost simultaneously, their wings slicing through the morning air. Within hours, one of them would find the enemy and the calm of the Coral Sea would vanish in fire and smoke. Fire in the sky. The dawn of May 8, 1942, came quietly, but every man in the Coral Sea knew the silence wouldn't last. The clouds hung low and heavy, the sea unusually calm, as if the ocean itself was waiting for the first bomb to fall. On the decks of the USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, pilots stood by their planes, helmets strapped, faces pale but determined. The word had spread through both fleets: the Japanese carriers had been found. The long hunt was over. At 5:45 a.m., radar screens aboard the Yorktown flickered with distant echoes. Reports from scout planes confirmed it. Two large enemy carriers, Shokaku and Ziwikaku, with escorts, were spotted less than 200 miles away. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, standing on the bridge, gave the order that would ignite the first carrier versus carrier clash in history: launch all aircraft. Engines roared to life. Deck crews worked with precision, guiding aircraft into position with glowing wands as propellers screamed in the humid air. The smell of fuel and exhaust hung thick over the flight deck. One by one, the planes raced down the carrier's runway, leaping into the sky and disappearing into the clouds. In total, over 70 American aircraft surged toward the Japanese fleet, flying low over the water to avoid detection. Far across the horizon, the Japanese were already doing the same. Almost simultaneously, their own strike groups had launched, guided by reports of American ships. It was a deadly coincidence: two fleets, unaware that their enemies' planes were already en route, each side hunting the other. The Coral Sea was about to become a graveyard in the sky. As the American planes approached, sunlight broke through the clouds, casting eerie shadows over the ocean. The first to spot the enemy was Lieutenant Commander William B. Ault from the Lexington. Through the haze, he saw the dark shapes of Japanese carriers, one maneuvering to the left, another turning hard to starboard. "Target in sight," he radioed calmly. "Commencing attack." Moments later, the air exploded into chaos. Japanese fighters, sleek Mitsubishi Zeros, climbed sharply to intercept the incoming bombers. Machine guns rattled, tracer fire cutting through the air like streaks of fire. American dive bombers peeled off, diving almost vertically toward their targets. The roar of engines merged with the thunder of anti-aircraft guns from the ships below. Bombs began to fall. Two direct hits struck the Japanese carrier Shokaku. The first tore open her forward flight deck, sending flames shooting skyward. The second detonated near her hangar, igniting fuel tanks and scattering aircraft in every direction. Smoke poured out, black and thick, covering the ship like a shroud. Below deck, sailors fought desperately to control the fires, but the heat was unbearable. For the first time, Japan's elite carrier force had been bloodied. But the Americans had no time to celebrate. Their planes were running low on fuel, and far behind them, another wave was coming, this time from the Japanese side. Around 11 a.m., radar operators aboard the Lexington picked up multiple incoming groups. Dozens of Japanese bombers and torpedo planes were heading straight for the U.S. fleet. Alarms wailed across both carriers. Pilots scrambled to their cockpits, anti-aircraft gunners rushed to their stations. Within minutes, the horizon filled with enemy aircraft. The battle that followed was like nothing anyone had ever seen. Torpedo planes came in low, skimming over the waves, while dive bombers plunged from the clouds above. The air turned into a storm of smoke, fire, and twisting metal. The Lexington's gunners opened up with everything they had, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. Several Japanese planes were torn apart midair, but enough slipped through to deliver their payloads. Two torpedoes slammed into the Lexington's port side, followed by a pair of bombs that struck near her island structure. The carrier shuddered violently. Inside, men were thrown off their feet as fire erupted across the hangar deck. Damage control crews rushed to seal compartments, but the flames spread faster than they could contain them. Within minutes, the proud Lady Lex was bleeding smoke into the bright sky. Meanwhile, the Yorktown was also under attack. Japanese dive bombers targeted her relentlessly, scoring one direct hit near the flight deck. The explosion blew a hole through the steel plating, but the damage was contained. Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns, manned by sweating, shouting sailors, managed to bring down several attackers. When the wave finally ended, the ship was battered but still afloat. By early afternoon, the battle had turned into a deadly dance of survival. Both sides had inflicted serious damage, yet neither had the strength for a decisive blow. The Japanese carriers, though crippled, managed to recover some aircraft. The Americans were busy saving their own wounded ship. On the Lexington, engineers believed they had stabilized the fires until 12:47 p.m., when a massive internal explosion ripped through the vessel. Gasoline vapors had ignited deep within her storage tanks. A second blast followed minutes later, then a third. The order came down: abandon ship. On the decks, chaos erupted as hundreds of sailors moved to the lifeboats. Smoke and flames towered high into the air, visible for miles. Pilots who had returned from battle helped carry the injured, others jumped into the sea as the fire consumed the ship. Nearby destroyers moved in to rescue survivors. From a distance, Yorktown's crew watched silently as their sister ship burned. The once mighty Lexington, pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now lay dying. At 5 p.m., after all survivors had been evacuated, the destroyer USS Phelps fired torpedoes into the crippled carrier to send her to the bottom. A great column of fire rose once more before the Lexington sank beneath the waves. The sea swallowed her slowly, leaving only oil and debris drifting on the surface. For many sailors, it was like losing a friend. As evening fell, both sides withdrew from the area, battered and weary. The Japanese had damaged one American carrier and sunk another, but they had also lost Chiho and rendered Shokaku unusable. Their invasion convoy had been ordered to turn back. For the first time in the war, Japan's advance had been stopped. In the quiet that followed, the survivors aboard Yorktown stood on deck watching the darkening horizon. The ocean was calm again, but it no longer felt peaceful. The air still smelled of smoke and burned fuel. Somewhere far away, faint lightning flashed across the clouds, a reminder that this was only one storm in a greater war yet to come. That night, the officers gathered on the bridge. Fletcher reviewed the battle reports, his face illuminated by the faint glow of chart lights. The outcome was uncertain, the cost was high. Yet deep down, everyone aboard knew they had witnessed history. For the first time, ships had fought each other without ever coming within sight. The era of battleships had ended. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. Aftermath of a draw. The sun rose over the Coral Sea on May 9, 1942, casting a pale light over a sea littered with debris, smoke, and the quiet reminders of a brutal confrontation. The battle had ended, but the consequences reverberated across the Pacific. Sailors who had survived the clash on the decks of Yorktown and Lexington moved slowly, some still dazed by the chaos, others haunted by the faces of friends lost to fire and torpedoes. The vastness of the ocean could not hide the scars of the first carrier versus carrier engagement in history. Admiral Fletcher walked along Yorktown's deck, surveying the damage and the exhausted faces of his men. Every gunner, pilot, and sailor had endured a test unlike any they had known before. The Lexington was gone, a stark reminder of the cost of modern naval warfare, but her sacrifice had not been in vain. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese plans to invade Port Moresby had been delayed. The loss of Chiho and the damage to Shokaku had forced the Japanese fleet to retreat and regroup. In naval strategy, even a partial victory could shift the balance of power, and the Coral Sea had done exactly that. Across the water, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi and his staff aboard the Ziwikaku nursed their own wounds. The Japanese fleet had inflicted serious damage on the Americans, but the destruction of Chiho and the crippling of Shokaku forced them to reconsider the tempo of their advance. The aura of invincibility that had followed the Imperial Japanese Navy since Pearl Harbor was beginning to fracture. Takagi convened his officers in the dim light of the bridge. Maps were spread across tables, marking retreating ships and lost aircraft. The realization was sobering: the Americans were capable of fighting back, and the age of unchallenged supremacy in the Pacific was over. On both sides, the human cost of the battle was staggering. Over 200 American airmen and sailors had perished or gone missing, while Japanese losses were equally severe. Pilots who had plunged from the sky to deliver bombs now faced the same sea that had swallowed their comrades. Yet amid grief, a quiet sense of determination settled among the survivors. Every man understood that Coral Sea had not been a complete victory or defeat, but a turning point, the first clash where the Japanese advance had been halted by the American fleet. Back on Yorktown, Fletcher and his officers analyzed every aspect of the encounter. Tactical reports highlighted lessons for the future. Air reconnaissance had proven critical: carriers could strike without engaging battleships directly, and control of the skies above the ocean was now paramount. These insights would shape American strategy in the coming months. The Navy's leadership recognized that the aircraft carrier had emerged as the new centerpiece of naval warfare, a realization that would dictate the outcome of future engagements across the Pacific. Elsewhere, word of the battle slowly reached home. In the United States, newspapers described the sinking of the Lexington, but they also emphasized the courage of American pilots and the successful defense against Japan's Port Moresby invasion. Morale soared even amid sorrow. Coral Sea had demonstrated that the Pacific War was not a one-sided affair, and that American ingenuity, courage, and coordination could challenge even the most formidable enemy. For the Japanese, the defeat had profound strategic implications. Port Moresby remained beyond reach, which meant that their southern expansion in the Pacific was stalled. More importantly, the loss of Shoho and the damage to Shokaku meant that Japan could not muster a sufficient carrier force for the upcoming Battle of Midway. Commanders realized that underestimating American resolve and intelligence capabilities would cost them dearly. The seeds of overconfidence, which had driven the rapid expansion of the Japanese Empire, now threatened to undermine it. Life at sea after Coral Sea was a mixture of reflection and preparation. American sailors repaired what they could, trained their replacements, and tended to the wounded. Yorktown herself required repairs but remained seaworthy, a testament to her resilience and the skill of her crew. Meanwhile, Japanese carriers limped back to safe harbors, replenishing aircraft and fuel, aware that the next confrontation would be decisive. Both fleets understood that the Pacific Ocean had become a theater of constant vigilance, where surprise and planning would determine survival. Strategically, Coral Sea marked a psychological shift. For the first time, the Allies had directly challenged Japanese supremacy and forced them to retreat. This victory, however incomplete, inspired confidence across the Pacific. Commanders on both sides learned to adapt, innovate, and respect the new dynamics of naval warfare. Aircraft carriers had proven their worth, and naval planners began to envision entire campaigns built around these floating air bases, rather than relying solely on battleships and coastal bombardments. For ordinary sailors, the memories of Coral Sea were vivid and personal. Stories of pilots diving through anti-aircraft fire, gunners racing to reload cannons under scorching heat, and sailors abandoning ship in flames circulated among the fleet. These tales forged a sense of camaraderie and resilience. Men who had faced death together now shared a quiet bond, a recognition that survival required courage, skill, and trust. It was these intangible lessons beyond maps and charts that would guide the U.S. Navy in the months to come. By the time the sun set on May 10, the Coral Sea was quiet once more, though it bore the marks of the recent struggle. Smoke plumes lingered on the horizon, flotsam from the Lexington drifted slowly, carried by the currents, and the waves themselves seemed heavy with remembrance. Fletcher ordered his remaining forces to consolidate, repair, and prepare for the inevitable continuation of the Pacific campaign. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese were doing the same, planning their next move, unaware that the balance of power had begun to tilt. Coral Sea did not end the Pacific War. It did not deliver a decisive victory. But it changed the game entirely. It proved that the United States could confront Japan on equal terms, that intelligence and air power could tip the scales, and that courage and coordination were as deadly as any weapon. In the weeks that followed, these lessons would guide the Navy toward Midway, the next critical confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific. As night fell, sailors aboard Yorktown looked out over the endless black waves, reflecting silently. The stars mirrored their calm determination. Coral Sea had tested them, scarred them, and humbled them, but it had also illuminated a path forward. They were no longer mere participants in the war, they had become the vanguard of a new era in naval combat. And in the quiet night, with the ocean stretching to infinity, they understood that the true battle for the Pacific was only just beginning.